Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The outbreak of the deadly Ebola epidemic has cut a swathe through West Africa. But now that it's reached West Texas, it's really made the powers sit up and take notice with a big conference in London this week.
It's no great mischief if they fall in Sierra Leone or Liberia, at least not unless there's a profit in it. The US first response to the epidemic in Africa was their default position: send in the army.
By contrast, Cuba's response was their default position: send in the doctors. Joining us now to discuss the phenomena of Cuban medical diplomacy, which has restored sight and sound to those without it all over the world and is now wading fearlessly into the Ebola pandemic, is Bernard Regan of Britain's finest solidarity campaign, the Campaign for Cuba. Bernard, it is a phenomenal thing that Cuba, in many respects a poor country, a third world country, is actually responsible for medical diplomacy that has cured hundreds of thousands of people around the world of blindness, deafness. It's an internationalist weapon that Cuba is deploying here.
It's absolutely amazing, George. In fact, if you look back over the 55 years since the Cuban Revolution happened and overthrew the dictator Fulgencio Batista, they have treated an estimated 85 million people across the globe.
85 million.
And currently this year...
There was me underestimating, not often.
It's phenomenal. And this year alone, they have something like 50,000 medics in the field in 155 countries. So there are very few countries in the world that haven't at some time benefited from Cuba's medical action. And as you said in the introduction, they are now responding to the crisis in West Africa.
So that makes them having more doctors in the world than the World Health Organization.
That's true. The number of doctors, as I've said, for example, going to Sierra Leone is 165 in the first instance, but the plan is to send an additional 300. And as you alluded to in the introduction to the program, the United States response was to send 3,000 soldiers and 62 clinicians. Quite different.
This must represent a huge investment by Cuba. 50,000 doctors to spare, whilst here in our own country we're short of doctors.
Yes, I mean, this is an important point because Cuba, in the country itself, has a ratio of 1 doctor per 210 people. And we in Britain have a ratio of 1 to 370. And notwithstanding that, they're still able to provide the medical support. And this isn't a one-off. They've responded to a number of crises that have happened over the years.
Earthquake in Kashmir, in Pakistan.
Absolutely.
They've been everywhere saving lives.
And they've established Henry Reeve Brigade, which is a detachment, a medical detachment, particularly established to respond to crisis situations. So they were, in fact, prepared to go to the United States of America when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, but the Americans never replied to their offer, which is interesting because I think the important thing about Cuba is that it is prepared to offer help unconditionally. It doesn't say, who are you? Do you like us? Do you support us? It says this is a human catastrophe. It needs an actual practical response, and they go and do it. The example you cited, Kashmir, in fact, when the Cubans went, they had no political or diplomatic relations with Pakistan, but they made that absolutely secondary. They said, our job is to go and to help people, and they sent 2,500 medics who went into areas of the country that even the government found difficulty in reaching, treating something like 70% of the victims of the earthquake. More than 1 million people were killed or injured during that, and they treated 70% of them. And they left behind, and this is an important thing, it's not just the response to the immediate crisis, but the legacy, a very practical legacy, not just the emblematic. that they actually left behind 32 field hospitals that people could continue to use. And also they established relations with Pakistan so that young people from Pakistan went to Cuba to train as doctors as part of an ongoing program. And that's been the case in Africa and in Latin America, and even for some poor students from the United States who couldn't afford to go to medical schools in the US have been offered places to train as doctors in Cuba and then to return.
Well, that's a very interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But I did watch Michael Moore's film Sicko about the different medical systems that they have in the world. And he took people who were firefighters who had been damaged in 9/11, rescuing people who couldn't get medical treatment because they didn't have insurance in the United States, or not enough insurance. He took them to Cuba where they were treated entirely for free. And I never forgot the picture of bewilderment on the face of the American patients when they were looking around for someone to pay and asking, how much is this going to cost? And the Cubans' faces were equally bewildered. What do you mean cost? Health doesn't cost anything in Cuba. So here we have a small country which has achieved phenomenal levels of healthcare in its own country, now exporting around the world the benefits of that healthcare. This is socialism in action.
I think it's interesting just to think of the fact that when we talk about these statistics in relation to Cuba, if Britain were to apply a similar process, we would be talking about multiplying those figures 6 times. The population of Cuba is only 11 million. We have 66 million in Britain. If you think of the number of doctors and the resources that could be put in the field just by Britain alone, let's leave aside France, Germany and all the other countries in the world, you could see a fantastic transformation in the life and well-being of people, particularly in countries like Africa. And I think in continents like Africa, and I think an important thing is that whereas we have seen, for example, in the British Health Service, doctors being brought from Africa and other countries to work here, Cuba is doing the reverse. It's going to those countries and also is providing the infrastructure to begin to build the health services within those countries by training the doctors who will then return home. And that's an incredible legacy to leave behind, something of real value. And it contrasts, if you like, with the way in which Western Europe, America, and many other countries take doctors away from much needed areas. Cuba is, on the other hand, going there and helping and putting something back.
So in just 55 years, leaving aside, because people would have different views on it, leaving aside the achievements inside Cuba itself, in 55 years on the international scene, Cuba has played a decisive role in the defeat of apartheid South Africa, which was recognized by Mandela. The first country he visited after his release was, of course, as you know, South Africa. And this medical diplomacy, which is actually even more staggeringly generous than I had imagined. You must be very proud to be one of the leaders of a solidarity campaign with such a country.
Well, I think humbled is the word. I think not proud. I mean, I think it is staggering. I think there is not a comparable response by any other country in the world. It shows, I think, a legacy. The Cubans often express it in this way. They say solidarity is not giving what you have left over, but it's sharing what you have. And I think that is really the hallmark of the way in which they've done this. And although, you know, I acknowledge that you use the word medical diplomacy, I think it's something more than that. I think it's human solidarity, of which this is an important part. We could talk about literacy and about their contribution in education, which is equally phenomenal. They've contributed to the eradication of illiteracy in countries like Venezuela and Bolivia, throughout Latin America. They've initiated reading programs which have been utilized in more so-called advanced countries like Spain and New Zealand. And I think they see this as very much the development of the whole person, that health and education are fundamental to people having to be able to live creative and positive lives.
Well, you could see why the US hates them because of this contrast that you have drawn, because Cuba, as an example, that you don't have to see the price of everything and the value of nothing, that it's possible for values to supersede price. Is there any sign of US hostility to Cuba diminishing?
I think my honest answer is sadly no. Perhaps verbally it's less aggressive, maybe less ostentatious in its animosity towards Cuba. For example, it's a long time since the actual invasion of the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and there haven't been any direct military threats, although they countenance and give cover to people who are carrying out terrorist acts against Cuba. But the reality is that the United States is continuing to impose a severe and savage blockade against Cuba. It means that the Cuban economy over the last 50 years has lost something like $1 trillion, and it's not a rich country, which is impacted. It means that when, for example, they want to buy medicine, they have to go looking elsewhere because many of the pharmaceutical companies are US companies and won't trade with Cuba. So they have to look elsewhere. That adds to the costs of transportation. And this is, I give you a lot of examples of that. More recently, what seems to have been happening is that the United States has been imposing very heavy fines on banks like HSBC and other banks in Europe here and third countries for trading with Cuba. And of course, that means that those banks are reluctant or hesitant. And of course, all of this all the time is pushing up the cost to Cuba and so on.
Well, if the political diplomacy between the US and Cuba is not progressing, how about the medical diplomacy when they meet on the field? For example, US has sent all the troops to help in the Ebola-affected area in West Africa. And it's a specific tricky mission, yeah, because it's a big epidemic and medical workers have been attacked and even killed.
You're right, and I think that is going to be interesting. At the moment, they're operating in different countries, so that's not an immediate issue. The United States is principally focusing on Liberia. Cuba is based in Sierra Leone. But as George said at the beginning of the program, there is a conference taking place this week, or has taken place this week, which is coordinating or attempting to coordinate the response in West Africa. And Ban Ki-moon, the General Secretary of the United Nations, called 5 countries immediately to seek their support, one of which was Cuba, the others were the United States and Great Britain. And the Great Britain will have to, because it is operating in Sierra Leone also, will be looking to cooperate. Hopefully we will see that breaking down any kind of barriers. And we want to see that happening not just in relation to Britain, where it needs to develop much more, but also in relation to Europe as a whole. And that is something which is taking place slowly, but is beginning.
Bernard Reagan of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, thanks for coming on board the Sputnik. Coming up after the break, the best of our foreign correspondents, by far, intrepid and fearless, prodigious and eloquent. He's Patrick Coburn of The Independent, and he's up next. Welcome back to Sputnik. Patrick Coburn is Foreign Correspondent of the Year, and every year for me. He's just written the book on the phenomenon known as ISIS, on which the entire world is now fixated. And I'm glad to say he's on board the Sputnik. Terrific new book, absolutely timely. What's the truth about ISIS? Who are they? What are they? And what's the prospects of defeating them?
Well, an Afghan journalist once described movements like this as being wholly fascists. He then had to leave Afghanistan fairly quickly, but I think that sort of sums them up. They come out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq that has existed since the invasion of 2003. They've always been extremely anti-Shia, incredibly violent. Their ideology is not that different from Wahhabism.
In fact, if you take out YouTube and videos, their methods are strikingly similar to those used by Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, in conquering Saudi Arabia, conquering Mecca. In fact, Mecca surrendered to him. This ostentatious use of terror is not necessarily because they're sick individuals that they're performing these hideous acts of terror, though they may be. It's for the discouragement of the others to force surrender, isn't it?
Yes, it's ritual murders. I think what they have added, which is new, is that they put this online. It's on YouTube, these hideous, basically snuff movies, very professionally made, in which you see them taking Shia lorry drivers out of their lorries. There's a brief questioning to make sure of their religious affiliation, and then they're just taken beside the road and shot in the head. And this is the same thing happens to maybe Iraqi soldiers going to join their units. And this has an express purpose, which is to terrify people, and it sort of works. That's one of the reasons that the Iraqi army broke up in Mosul when ISIS took Mosul on the 10th of June.
Now, the tribes of Western Iraq, as you identified, sided eventually with the American-British occupation, drove these people out when they were called Al-Qaeda. But they have flourished again as a result of ground which has been fertilized by British and American policy in Syria. The encouragement of the revolt, as you put it, in Syria, the funding of it, and the provision of non-lethal military aid and so on. These are the conditions that have brought this organization back to life and, my goodness, back to death.
Yeah, no, it's well put. I think that, a point I make in the book, and I think it's very important, is that ISIS comes out of war. It's difficult to conceive of organizations like this coming out of any peaceable situation. So the continuation of the war in Syria, basically demanding that it can no negotiations except with Assad going, although Assad controls 13 out of 14 provincial capitals, so he obviously isn't going to go, is basically a recipe for the war going on. And it's in the conditions of war that ISIS has grown up again and flourished and taken over an area which is bigger than the size of Great Britain.
And yet, there are only 20,000 of them, according to the New York Times. Is that an underestimated figure? But even if it is, there must be a level in a territory that size of quiescence by the tribes, for example, who drove them out once before, could drive them out again, but are not. I'm arguing that they are a kind of, or an expression of, or a manifestation of an allergic reaction amongst Sunnis in Iraq to the kind of policy, politics, and structure that we imposed on Iraq after the invasion in 2003.
They're a reaction against Maliki, Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister. Of course, one can say, why was Nouri al-Maliki the Prime Minister of Iraq from 2006? Because he was appointed by the United States ambassador. I think it's true of all countries that are invaded from the outside. Then their leadership are appointed from the outside, not by the indigenous population. This is a recipe for disaster. And in Iraq, there has been a disaster. You had this regime, which is really a kleptocracy, stealing from everybody, $100 billion a year in oil revenues, but no water, no electricity for much of the country. Bad for Shia, bad for Kurds, but even worse for Sunni, because they were discriminated against, they were persecuted. If you were a Sunni young man in the villages outside Fallujah, you'd have got a very good chance of being arrested, tortured, forced to confess, and you could end up on death row. And there are villages with few young men left. And you can be on death row for a crime that somebody else has already been executed for, but it doesn't do you any good. So you can imagine what it's like for these young men. That ISIS may be violent, but at least it's something. It's better than sitting in your village waiting to be arrested and tortured.
What's the prognosis, Patrick? You've been there, down amongst it all. I argued in Parliament last week that this rather desultory bombing by British and American jets is not only not going to solve this problem, but may very well exacerbate it.
Yes, because it's going to create more war. You know, you could say if you bomb the columns of ISIS on the road to Erbil, that may deter people. But then this is basically a guerrilla force, so it doesn't make itself available for bombing. But it means that the war will get worse. And it's in these conditions that ISIS flourishes. Its leadership is very experienced, extremely violent, but they know about fighting. And they survived bombing before. I mean, there's an absurdity about the present bombing as a way of extinguishing ISIS. But what happened in 2007 when the Americans had 150,000 troops there? The British had several thousand troops. They were bombing all the time. But this group, which was much smaller then, in the shape of Al-Qaeda, survived and is still with us today. So why should it work this time?
Even if they succeeded, the United States and Britain are openly saying that once we've defeated ISIS, we're going to build an army of moderate extremists and point them towards Baghdad and ask them to march.
Yes, I mean, there are two sort of elements of fantasy in this. One is that the Iraqi army is going to march into Mosul and other places and restore law and order. Now, the people of Mosul may be terrified. The Sunni people, the Christians and the Yazidis and the others have had to flee or already been killed. But the Sunni may not like them, but they're even more terrified of the Iraqi army and the militias coming with them. I have friends in Mosul who email me, and there are these twin terrors. It's the same in Syria. So the idea that the moderates, the third force, which seems to be straight out of Graham Greene, the quiet American, it doesn't really exist. And this poor old third force, which is yet to be vetted and sent to Saudi Arabia to be trained, is then going to fight not just ISIS, but is going to fight the Syrian army of Assad. So this is the stuff of fantasy. I mean, this group doesn't exist.
I described them in Parliament last week as imaginary armies.
Yeah.
All these groups are imaginary armies, as is, I think, it's my last question that we've got time for, the so-called Arab participation in this. It's a touch imaginary too, isn't it? There's no prospect at all of the United Arab Emirates sending boots onto the ground in Iraq or Syria, neither Saudi Arabia.
No, I don't think so. But I think that there's a reason for getting them on board. Because previously, and really pretty well up to the present moment, they were the covert supporters of the jihadi movement in Syria and in Iraq. They provided money. They may not like ISIS much at the moment, but it's kind of a Frankenstein monster that they created. So I think the reason the Americans were so keen to have them is, although publicly they said, these guys are with us, it's to make sure they weren't with the other side. I think that's the real agenda.
Well, it simply couldn't be better timed. Your new book, The Jihadis Return, by Patrick Coburn and OR Books. I really encourage everyone watching this to get themselves a copy. It's a handbook that everyone who's seeking to understand these matters needs to have with them. Patrick Coburn, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Sputnik. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, why is it that we don't know about these Cuban medical workers, these doctors, surgeons working all over the world and healing people? Saladin Returns answers that because no enemy of the US can ever do any good. Cubans are probably planning to overthrow US from other countries at the moment.
Even I didn't know the scale of this medical solidarity that Cuba's involved in.
On ISIS, Jane Limer says that ISIS may be defeated, but as shown before, when you remove one layer of an ideology, like a Russian doll, another is revealed. And Basharat Ali makes the point that How is that before the vote from last week for war, we are under imminent threat to our very lives, and then it all goes quiet? Quiet in the sense that it's not as imminent anymore?
Look, we are under threat from these people. There are hundreds of British citizens fighting with these fanatics, and one day they'll all come back here unless they're killed before that. When they come back here, all dressed up, nowhere to go except looking for ways to harm us. But they are not an army. It's not a conventional war, and therefore the methods of conventional war for countering it are entirely inappropriate.
And that's all that we have for this week.
Which sadly means that's the end of the show.
Will you please keep in touch with us on RT_Sputnik, and for Facebook, like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.